Thanks for checking out Scotty's Hobbies. Today we're going to be replacing the rear pads and rotors on this 2009 Ram 1500 pickup. This will be the same, if not very similar, to many other year makes and models. I believe this whole job for just the Ram covers all the way from a 2002 to a 2021 Ram truck. All of the 1500s with this setup pretty much. It's a 20-year span pretty much, so pretty cool. A ton of vehicles. So we're already getting started. You can see you got to take the wheel off to get to the brakes. That's the obvious part. If you can't do this, you might want to have somebody else go ahead and help you out to get this job done. But with this video, you'll be able to get everything done. You'll know what tools you'll need, the torque specifications that you need to tighten everything to, and I'll give you as many tips and tricks as I can along the way. First, let's get started by seeing what needs to be replaced or removed and what does not need to be removed. You might find something rubbing at this point or see something else that might need to be replaced. You can see we're going to take these caliper bolts off right here. Caliper bolt and the bracket bolt both need to be removed. While we're going through the video, I'll show you the tools that you need and the torque specifications. The banjo bolt right here is not going to be removed, and neither is the bleeder. If you open up either one of those two, you will need to bleed the brakes. But if you follow the way I'm doing everything, you will not need to bleed the brakes when you're done. You will just need to pump the brakes before you get on your way. So it builds up pressure in the line, so you actually have fluid going into the piston, pushing pressure or putting pressure onto the rotor. Using a 10mm, preferably 6-point socket, remove both of your caliper bolts. Set them off to the side. If these are old, worn out, stripped out, or anything like that, you can find a new hardware kit, and they're not expensive at all. As well as if you see boots or any type of moisture around the boots right here on the caliper, this would be a great time to replace them because you should not have any moisture around those boots. Before we push the piston into the caliper, we need to make sure your fluid reservoir cap is off or loosened up. So when we put pressure or the fluid back into the system, it builds up pressure, it doesn't blow any seals out. I'm putting pressure on the rotor right there using a flathead screwdriver. These rotors were a little bit warped, so there's a lip on the edge, so I couldn't get the caliper to slide right off. So I had to push those pistons in, or push the piston in a little bit, release the pressure on it, and lift it right off. Super easy. Make sure you take a look at your slider pins, or your anti-vibration shims, I should say, or the anti-squeak shims, however you want to refer to them. Make sure they're the same, the ones that you have and the same ones that are on the vehicle. Take pictures at every step that you go too, so in case when you're putting it back together, you're like, uh-oh, which way did that go? Which one was on the top? Which one was on the bottom? You have pictures of it. Everything is documented. Now we are using a 21mm 6-point impact socket. I'm using a breaker bar, a 1/2-inch breaker bar to loosen up this bolt. I don't want to use any air tools. It would speed up the process for me by a lot, but I try to use the tools that you would in your driveway at home and make it the easiest or the best way that you would be able to do it the same way, I guess. So now I've switched over to a socket wrench, just so it's a little bit faster to get that gear drive going. Use the breaker bar to loosen them up, break them loose, use your wrench to take them off. When you get these bolts off, you can see there is a little bit of Loctite on these threads. So they are a little bit of a pain in the butt to get all the way out. They are a little bit tighter than finger tight, so how to use the socket wrench the whole way getting it out. If you need any tools shown in this video, make sure you take a look in the description below. I should have a link for everything down there for you, everything you need to get this job done at least. Now that you have the caliper bracket off, go ahead and take the pads out, but don't throw them away too soon because you're going to use these pads to compress the piston back into the caliper so you don't ruin your brand new pads. Now let's go over a few questions that you might have about the brake job process. How much did this cost? For me, for this vehicle, I believe the parts are around $200, and obviously my labor is free. And that's for some good pads and rotors on this. I did the Power Stop Evolution Plus kit. So it's the ceramic pads with a hardware kit. and new factory OEM rotors. You can see this rotor was kind of hard to get off. It was nice and tight, just seized onto the hub from over time. This vehicle has never had a brake job in the past, and if you rewind just a little bit, you'll see I used some dikes to break off a little, what I call a production washer, that holds the rotor in place when they're putting everything together. And you can see what I do as like such of a production washer coming up in a little bit. Now I used my dead blow hammer, my favorite hammer, to get this rotor off. It doesn't do any damage to the hub, or I hope it doesn't do any damage to the hub. It hasn't in the past, so hopefully this isn't a start. But don't hesitate. You're not going to break anything. Just hit it with a hammer, get it off. Just make sure you're using a new rotor. Now this is your parking brake assembly. You can see on the bottom, this is just like a shoe. On the old drum style brakes, the inner side of your rotor is practically a drum for the parking brake. So there's a star right here on the bottom that you're going to turn, and that's going to push the piston, or it's going to push the ears out. So it's going to make it apply pressure to the drum a little bit sooner than it was before. If you have a little bit of play, if your rotor turns back and forth, on the passenger side I had a lot more play than on the driver's side. If you do have that play, you can put your rotor on. You don't want to have a lot of friction. You want to just have a tad bit of friction to be able to move your rotor, but not be able to spin it. It's a rear-wheel drive, and yeah, you're not going to be able to spin it. But you just want to have a tad bit of friction, not a lot of friction at all on that parking brake. Now get your new rotor. This is a power stop rotor, one of my favorites, and in the last week I think I've done 5 brake jobs with the power stops. I bet the UPS guy's tired of dropping off really heavy packages, I guess you could say. Now here's what I do pretty much for the production washer that I broke off to get the rotor off. I'm using a larger nut. That's like a 7/8 nut, and now I'm putting on a lug nut onto that nut, so it applies pressure to the rotor, holding it onto the hub. It doesn't wobble around when I'm trying to bolt everything up when it comes to the caliper and the bracket. Makes everything a lot easier just by that little trick. It'll speed you up, it'll save a lot of time for you. Now that the rotor's up there, let's go ahead and take some time and give the caliper bracket some attention. We're going to put new shims. These are anti-squeak shims, or anti-vibration shims, whatever you want to call them. But we're going to put new ones on. I always recommend replacing these whenever you're doing a brake job, no matter what the vehicle is. Always get a brake pad set that has a hardware kit. Now, this is where I said in the previous part of the video, take pictures. Make sure that your clips are going on in the same fashion they came off. These ones had a little bit of a tab on one side and not the other, so they were directional. And if you forgot how they went on, or when you're done with the brakes, something just doesn't fit right, you'll have those pictures look back like, oh, that's it. I used a light hammer just to tap them into place, get them nice and seated onto the ears of that caliper bracket. I figured out that it was a lot easier to get the inboard pad into the caliper bracket. I'm saying caliper bracket a lot, so hopefully you like caliper brackets. But it was a lot easier to load the brake pad when it was out of the vehicle like this rather than when it was in. I honestly couldn't get it to load while it was in there. You might be able to do it, and let me know if you did. Comment below. There might be a little trick to get it in there, but I had to pull up on the sides of the shims to get the pad to fit properly. That was a little bit of an issue, but again, it's much easier to load the inboard pad and get the caliper bracket mounted than it is to get everything, get that inboard pad in there. So now that you have your pads, you found out you want these really awesome pads, you bought them from the links in the description below. How long does it take to get this job done? Here in the driveway, in my driveway, with the experience I have, the video I shot was about 42 minutes long, I believe, right around there. And that was grabbing extra parts and everything. So both sides, you're looking about just under 2 hours, hour and 45 minutes to get this job done. If you were to take it to a shop, they might charge you probably an hour and a half or an hour of labor. So around here, $120 would be a good going rate for labor minimum. And then the pads and the rotors, the parts, that would be whatever they're going to charge. I wouldn't expect to pay less than $250 for pads and rotors at a shop. So roughly, if you were going to get this job done at a shop, about $400-ish just for the rears. The dealership, I looked it up, would be about $600. So don't go there if you don't have the money, or if you're getting on with the installation process. Let's get both of these caliper bracket bolts installed. They do have that Loctite on them. I would not reapply or put any new Loctite on these bolts. What is there is plenty enough, and if you're properly torquing everything down, I really don't think Loctite is necessary. So that's up to you. And hey, if you do use Loctite, let me know below if you have any problems, or if you do, or why you don't use Loctite. That'd be kind of cool. I haven't heard any horror stories or anything, but I just don't prefer it if I'm using torque specifications. Using a 1/2 inch socket wrench, I'm tightening down this 21 millimeter 6-point bolt, and I'm going to use a 1/2 inch torque wrench, and I'm going to tighten these down to 120 foot-pounds. That's why it was so hard to get the leverage to get these things off, because 120 foot-pounds and me, 160 pounds soaking wet, it's, well, give or take, it's kind of hard to get the leverage needed. So 120 foot-pounds, 1/2 inch torque wrench, 21 millimeter 6-point socket is what's needed to get your caliper bracket installed. When you get that all done, set your torque wrench off to the side, and make sure you take the torque. So whatever you had it set to 120, pull it back out to 0 on your torque wrench and store it at 0. Don't ever store your torque wrench with a loaded, or with a number loaded into it. That'll ruin the torque wrench. So a little tip for you. Now, these sliders on the caliper, we're going to take these off, and you're going to clean them off with like a not really a Brillo pad. That's going to be a little bit rough. Don't use sandpaper, but say a green pad, or like the little Scotch pad that you find to wash your dishes. Use that to wash this slider off, and maybe some WD-40, but nothing more than that. And now you're going to apply some brake grease. Make sure you get some high temp brake grease. Be pretty liberal with this. I like to stuff some grease into the side of the boots as well before I install these. When you push your sliders in, a lot of grease will pop out the other side. Just wipe that off. Who cares? As long as you get some to stay on the inside and keep this thing lubricated, that's all that really matters. This is kind of wasteful right here, kinda, but as long as you get some grease in there, you're going to be totally fine. When you're all said and done with these, make sure everything, or these slide in and out freely, and then you're going to wipe everything up. Make sure it's nice and clean. You don't want any of this grease to fall off and get on a pad or a rotor. And again, if you find that these boots are ripped or cracked or look like they're going to fall apart, just go ahead and replace these boots right now. Sorry I didn't have to replace them, so yeah, you don't get the luxury of that in this video. Maybe you can find another one if you need to do that, but this should be a pretty simple, straightforward job. You can see both of my sliders get nice and lubed. I have some grease stuffed into those little accordion boots. See, there's a lot that's popped out right there. Just set that off to the side, get rid of it. Just make sure you get some grease to stay in there so that your slider freely moves in and out. So when you push on the brakes, it'll apply the pressure, and when you let off, it'll be able to slide back. Not let it comes completely off the rotor, but just enough to where you don't get that friction to slow you down. Again, wipe everything off, keep it nice and clean. Makes your job a lot easier. Somehow I still end up getting pretty darn dirty, so even though this is clean, you still get dirty. I like to use gloves, you can see. This keeps my hands, my nails from getting really, really bad. And there might be a link in the description for gloves too, but I'm always wearing gloves. For some reason, I'm a mechanic, I work with my hands a lot, but I have some really nice hands, I think. I wish I could show you a picture. But, whole nother story. Getting the outboard pad loaded. I had to move the tabs or the ears up on both sides. Just give it a little bit of extra room to push the pad into the anti-vibration or the anti-squeak shims right there. You can see I used a flathead. I didn't put too much pressure, just enough to get the pad to slide into place. I don't want to bend it out of proportion or make it have too much friction and cause the pad to get stuck cockeyed. So make sure everything moves freely in and out. You don't want to put any grease or lube on the sides of the pads where it hooks onto the caliper bracket. Some people do, but I think that builds up grease, and over time that could cause problems. So in my opinion, and the way I do brakes, I do not put grease or any type of lubricant on the pads themselves on the side where it meets the caliper. Now we're going to press the piston back into the caliper itself. Remember earlier in the video, we released the cap, or we took the cap off the fluid reservoir up under the hood. That's just sitting there right on top of the reservoir. That's because right now, when we push this piston into this caliper, all the fluid's going to go back up into that reservoir. Hopefully, you have that cap off, and when it needs somewhere to go, it just overflows onto the ground, onto your pig pad or whatnot. But it doesn't have the cap on to blow any seals out somewhere else. I do like this type of, or this style of caliper compressor, but there is a lot of different variants out there. So if you have a different one, or if one suits your needs better, just in this case, all we need to do is push that piston all the way back into the caliper, make sure it's pretty flush. And again, when you're pressing in on this piston, take a look at the boot right there. Around the piston, make sure that boot doesn't have any tears, any rips, any leaks or anything like that. Just visually be aware of what you're working with, because you don't want to have to take everything apart and do this job all over again. If you need to, you might as well just throw another caliper on. You can see I'm using the bolts that are the bolts to hold the caliper onto the bracket. I'm using those to push the extra grease out of the holes of those sliders, because again, there's a lot of extra grease. Those sliders are pretty tight, but you want to make sure they're well greased. Make sure you have a nice clean area. Make sure you have the threads all cleaned up on those screws, and get this caliper on. On the upper side, you have that little L, the little clip that hooks up there on the top. On the bottom side of the bracket, you hook that first. Make sure your slider pins are pushed back as far as possible. You can see there's that clip on the top of that caliper right there. That's got to clip in first, and then that'll allow you to push the caliper all the way down into the bracket. You got to make sure the boots, or their sliders on that back side, are pushed all the way to the, inside of the vehicle, so it'll sit flush. If you have any problems getting anything to settle into place or get into place, don't force anything. At this point, you would way rather take everything apart, make sure everything is nice and the way it should be, and put it on to where it just floats right together. You don't want to force anything. If you do, you're probably doing something wrong. You're probably going to have squeaking. You're probably going to run into some problems later. So take your time. Everything should set gently into place, and don't rush. Now, tightening these 10mm bolts onto your caliper bracket. This is what's holding the caliper on. These, again, 10mm, and we're only torquing these down to, 22 foot-pounds. That is super like nothing, but as long as it's properly torqued down, you know you're good. Now take off your production washer, or production bolt in my case, and get everything back together. Before you get going on your way, you put everything back together. Before you put your wheel on, go over and pump your brakes. Even before you put that fluid reservoir on, pump the brakes, make sure everything is nice and getting pressure. You don't have any leaks back here. Double check all your bolts, your caliper, your bracket bolt, all that is nice and tight. Again, we're not going to touch the banjo bolts. We're not touching that, so that you shouldn't have anything leaking from there, and you should not have to touch your bleeder right here. I do have a video on how to pressure bleed the brakes using a helper, so check out the video library. And I do have a ton of videos covering this Dodge Ram, such as the PCV valve, the front brakes, some HVAC stuff, a lot of stuff on this Dodge, so make sure you check out my video library. If this video did help you out, make sure you comment below, let me know the year, make, and model. I always like to hear that these videos do make a difference for you guys, so let me know, please. Like, subscribe, and share. Tell everybody about me. If you know somebody that has a vehicle, I probably have something on their vehicle for vehicle routine maintenance. So let them know about me, please. I'll see you guys on the next hopefully helpful video. Thanks for checking out Scotty's Hobbies.